Good morning. This is the 2001 Chevy Suburban that's going to be the donor vehicle for the 1991 Pontiac shop truck. It's got the 5.3 automatic in it and it runs well. Let's get started and remove this thing. The engine sounds good. This is the last time it's going to run in the Suburban. The next time it fires up, it'll be in the 91 Chevy shop truck. Disconnect the battery first. Okay, here's a tip for you. As you can tell by looking at the water pump pulley, it's been on there quite a while. In order to separate the engine-driven fan from that pulley, especially in this case with a little bit of rust, I use a large crescent wrench that is big enough to fit onto the nut that turns that. And then in order to keep that pulley from turning, you're going to have something to keep it from spinning. And you can buy tools and they cost $20-30, and I say you can do it for a lot less. This is a piece of angle iron. I measured the distance between the two holes and drilled holes. I put in a bolt, 2 bolts, and spot welded them in place. Cut out a notch here in the middle to go around the pulley itself, and then I cut this down so that it would just slip into the spot easier. The only thing I would suggest doing at all would be to make this longer. This is about 12 to 14 inches. I would make it about 2 feet. But as you can see, the pulley has 4 holes in it. So you can take those bolts, they line up in the holes like that, and they will hold that pulley steady while you're turning the nut on the fan to get it off. So think about that ahead of time. And if you haven't already had to replace a water pump or remove the fan from your engine, go ahead and get a piece of angle iron and put some bolts in it like that. You can make it for cheap, for actually next to nothing, just a little bit of work, and it'll do the job. And if you happen to own a Dodge or a Jeep product, it works the same way. The holes in the water pump pulley are slightly different. They're a little wider apart, but make a tool for that. It'll make your life a lot easier. I can't say about a Ford. We're making some headway. Now it's time to stop and take a lunch break, as much as I hate to. We've got the front end apart so that the engine can come out straight out the front. A little more work to do on the top end, and I'm going to remove the intake manifold. Just makes it a lot easier to lift it up high enough to be able to clear the front bumper, and I'm going to be pulling it with the transmission. The extraction is complete. The engine's out. Now just a little cleanup, and we're going to pull the exhaust system off of the Suburban along with the air box and coolant overflow bottle and anything else we can find under here that we feel like we might need to go along with this. Based on the look of the motor, it's pretty grungy. I think we're going to have to go through it. I really don't see being able to just kind of power wash it, clean it up, and stab it in, although I'm tempted. Let's do it right. Making good progress. We've now got the engine out. Here's the engine on the transmission on the stand that I made to roll around the shop. Here's the wiring harness. So I'll deal with that later. Pretty much gutted under the hood of the truck. Got also AC components that I might be able to use. The coolant overflow tank and the air intake box. Well, that's going to be useful. And it is a drive-by-wire, so getting that harness out was a bit of a pain. But it's all coming out and all looking good. So we're making some progress. We finally finished up. We've got the engine and transmission pulled. We also got the complete harness pulled intact, no cuts whatsoever. Even the drive-by-wire harness we were able to get out. That was tedious. It goes through the driver's side of the firewall with a big mass of wiring, and you have to separate it out, get up under the dash, cut away the tape in order to free the harness. It's a pain in the ass, but it can be done. I can do it. You can certainly do it. I do have some tips for you though. If you've never done this before, or maybe you have, and you've struggled a bit, because I mean, if you're like me, you end up doing a lot of things alone because there's never anybody around to help you out when you really need it. To make it a little easier, at least for me, this is what I found on removing the motor. Remove the exhaust manifolds. Those bolts are a lot easier to reach. If they're going to break, they're going to break anyway, and you can always take care of that. But if you try to remove those 3 bolts that hold the little down tube that has your first O2 sensor in it, those bolts are hard as heck to get off. And even if you spray it with some liquid wrench or something like that, you're having to lay flat on your back, get up in there, adjust your sockets to try to get the right one in the right angle. It's a pain in the butt. Just take the bolts out of the exhaust manifold at the head, at the cylinder head. Easier to get to, and the engine will lift out easier. Secondly, if you're pulling your engine and transmission together, you need something to plug the end of your transmission. Otherwise, when you tilt it up and pull it out, your fluid's going to come out. It's going to look like a crime scene. Now, I've used these before. These little transmission plugs. That's what it looks like. They work okay. They're not great. They tend to leak. But they're better than nothing, and they are cheap. What I would suggest, if you have something around, what I use from one of the first swaps I ever did, I took the drive shaft, the input shaft to the transmission, and cut it off, and I used that physically to stick in the end of the transmission because I know it'll fit and it doesn't leak. And then because it has 2 holes on either side, I run a zip tie through it, and there's a little bracket on the tail shaft of the transmission. I run a zip tie through that to hold it in place so it doesn't fall out. Never a mess. Save yourself the trouble, because it's enough of you create enough of a mess with the antifreeze and power steering fluid and possibly brake fluid. Just every fluid you can imagine. Antifreeze is the worst. So at least transmission fluid you can take out of the equation. For me, unless if you're gonna pull the engine separate from the transmission, you can probably get away with just pulling the engine with the intake manifold in place. I take it off. I usually pull the engine and transmission together, and the way that engine is tucked under the cowl of Tahoes and Suburbans and Silverados, I use an engine tilter, and it is up against that metal before you know it. So I pull the intake manifold off. There's 10 bolts. They come out easy. Just lift it out of the way. That way you can drop your hoist down lower to the actual top of the motor, and you have more room to lift it up. It's something I've found that works for me. And you don't need any special tools to lift it with. My engine tilter has obviously 4 chains, and I get 4 bolts that fit within the threads of the head, and run 2 in the back of the heads and 1 on each side. Let's see, on the passenger side, on the front of the head, there's a couple of options there that are open, that are threaded. And then on the driver's side, it's not facing the front, it's right next to the temperature sending unit. There's a threaded hole there. I use those 4 constantly, and I've never had an issue. It works great. And the bolts that come off the engine, I save everything. I put them in a big bucket and keep them because they do come in handy later. The drive-by-wire harness, very tedious to get out. There is a large mass of wiring like this that goes in right between the power brake booster and the fender, and it is in those wires. And going underneath the dash, you can pull a few things apart and get the assembly out easy enough, but you have to cut the tape on that massive wiring up in the dash to pull it through. And it did, but I bet it took me an hour to get it all through there. But you can do it. An easier way would have been to trace the wire, get as much as you can, cut it, pull it out, and then pull it out from actually both ends, from under the dash, from under the hood, and splice them together. I don't like splicing things more than I have to, but it would be faster. If you're in a salvage yard, heaven help you. I hate pulling engines in the salvage yard. I've done it before. I've got the scars to prove it. But it is a pain in the ass because you're under a time crunch from the time when they're going to shut down at 6 o'clock or whenever they close. The weather, you can't control that. You're laying on gravel and mud. Never have quite the right tools. There's always something you left at home. I won't do it. unless an engine is just flat laying there for the picking, I will not pull an engine in a salvage yard. I do get a donor vehicle so that I can take my time with it. I would also say if you get one that's been hit, that's fine, but be careful of the ones that have been hit in the front, because it's hard enough to pull everything out when things are straight. But if you've got damaged sheet metal and bent this and bent that, it's a lot of work to get that out unless you've got the proper tools to cut away the sheet metal, like a plasma cutter or torch, stuff like that. Transmission. When you're disconnecting the fuel lines, you can disconnect them from the fuel rail, and in this case it has a return line, so there are two to disconnect. But those metal lines curve down to the back of the motor and run along the transmission over towards where the filter is. There is one bolt at the top. It's not the top center of where the transmission bolt. It's one to the left, which will be on the driver's side, down. If you can reach in there with a deep 13 millimeter, you can take that nut off, and there's a bracket there that holds those metal lines together to the engine. If you can get that nut off, then that'll free up your fuel lines so that once you disconnect it from the intake manifold, you don't have to cut anything below the truck. They'll be free. And I think that is, oh, last thing, transmission. The tail shaft, the transmission mount. There's 3 bolts. There are 2 that hold the mount to the transmission, and then there's one that goes down into the frame. And I've done it both ways. It's really tempting to get that one that goes through the frame because there's a hole there. You can just zip it out. The problem is when you go to lift it up, you've got to lift the tail shaft up high enough for that stud to clear the cross member. If you take the 2 screws out, they screw upwards into the mount, or into the transmission tail shaft. If you unscrew those, then the transmission can literally slide out. So you're having to disconnect 2 bolts instead of 1. It's a little bit more work, not much, but it allows that transmission to slide out instead of having to lift the back and move it forward and then try and tilt it and get it all out. Anyway, I hope you learned something. I hope you're following. If you hadn't subscribed, please do. First time to the site, welcome. I'm glad to have you. Let's follow along. It's going to take me a while. I had planned to, but that engine is a greasy mess. So I am going to pull it apart. I'm going to pull the heads off of it, and the valve covers the heads, oil pan, the front assembly, everything. We're going to clean it up and replace the front seal and the rear seal and the gaskets. It's 150, 200 bucks. While we're in there, let's do a oil pump while we're at it. Might as well. I have no idea how many miles are on this truck, and from the looks of it, it's a bunch. So we'll find out more when we tear into the motor, when we look at the cylinders. When I did a compression check earlier, it's been a few months ago now, the cylinder pressure was excellent in all the cylinders. So I think we're in good shape there. I think the short block is in good shape, but we'll find out when we tear into it. But that'll be on the next video. So thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.